Hello and welcome. Today we're going to make thin crust pizza. Two slightly different pizzas from one recipe. First, I want to thank everyone who has subscribed, and if you haven't already, please subscribe, and who's been sharing the videos and making comments and things. Thank you very much as always, and let's get to our ingredients and right into the pizza. Our ingredients for one pizza crust is 1 cup self-rising flour, 6 tablespoons of water, 1/8 teaspoon of salt, 1/8 teaspoon of Italian seasoning, and 2 tablespoons of olive oil for the dough. And for your toppings, mixed cheese is what I'm using, pizza sauce, pepperoni, Canadian bacon, black olives, pickled jalapenos, and diced onions. I like it sort of supreme. Alright, so this is, as I mentioned, a very easy recipe. In this case, we're just going to make a well-rounded, more of a moat around the center. And the reason I do that is just because you can kind of get everything to mix in a little better. And the only other thing I'm going to do here is just spread everything out before I initially mix it, just to give it a little more space. Now, I am using self-rising flour here, and if you don't have self-rising flour, you can basically replace it with any all-purpose flour at 2 teaspoons of baking powder per cup of flour. In this case, you would be making the self-rising flour. And what you'll have to do is sift those together, otherwise they won't quite get enough of an even distribution. The reason I'm actually using self-rising flour is that I can't get as good of a distribution of baking soda to flour as they can, and in this recipe it's kind of nice not to have any sort of pockets that don't do anything and pockets that do. This is a dryish dough, so it's going to come together as a shaggy dough, and then it's going to kind of slowly start to come together, and as it hydrates out, what you're looking for is a texture more than a specific amount, because I have noticed that from one bag of flour to the next, it could use about a tablespoon more water or a tablespoon less, depending on where it's at. It was almost always above, so generally if it's just a little dry, add just a little bit more water. And once it all starts to come together and finally forming into a nice dough ball, you're going to have a little bit of dry stuff left on the bottom side. So you're going to have to sort of work that in. Like I said, it is a dry dough, so you're going to have to work it a little bit for that. And what I'm going to be doing is just kind of twisting it around and trying to occasionally pushing it down and just kind of get pieces attached and adhered to the rest of the ball, and then they can kind of get pushed in. And once we're all done with this part, it's actually a good idea to rest the dough for about 5 minutes. But this will get all of our stragglers and bits and pieces mixed in, and we don't have to worry about anything. This is a little bit larger than what you guys are doing because I'm doing 2 here, so I can show you both of the ways to do this. So yours will be a bit smaller. Once we get our flour and all the ingredients combined and kind of got them fully mixed together, you're going to want to check at this point for how it feels. If it feels super soft and pillowy, then you're probably going to need a little bit more flour because it's not quite dry enough. Like I said, this really should be a dry dough. So what we're looking for is basically it'll feel and kind of have the same density as like Play-Doh or soft modelers. Not too hard, but also not too soft. If you have time, letting it rest for about 5 minutes after doing this is a really good idea, though I won't be doing that with either of these today. Alright, once our dough has rested or not, depending on what you wanted to do, we're going to just basically form it into a semicircle. You just got to get it roughly in a circle. You're going to roll it out, and it's going to mostly become a circle as you roll it out, and I'll show you how, which is what you see here. Each time you're rolling, you start in the center and you press outwards, and if you turn it about 10 degrees each time, you see me doing this here, this is how you make it round with no effort. Just always go forward and backwards. Don't turn yourself, turn the item, and you turn it about 10 degrees in between each one, and that is the easiest way to control how round it's going to be. Now, later on, you'll see me mess this up because I'll get a little impatient, because it will make you impatient. I guarantee you this. It's because you're going to be sitting there rolling this out, and instead of it taking, say, 2 or 3 minutes, it's going to take 5 or 6 if you do it this way. But again, if you do it this way and you want that picture-perfect round pizza and you're rolling it out, or even cookies and things and biscuits work the same way, if you want that picture-perfect roundness, you have to take the time and just do those small turns, roll it out once or twice, do another small turn, roll it out once or twice. It's a very time-consuming thing, but it is also kind of a handy skill to have, especially if you want to do pastries and things later, because once you get into pastries, doing stuff like this becomes very important. It is almost critical to some pastries that you do things like this. In the case of a pizza, that's not really the case here, so we don't have to worry too much. But, as you can see, doing this, it just goes out and stays nice and round. Now, like I said, I'm going to mess it up because I'm going to get a little impatient, and that's going to be the biggest handicap to this version, is that the impatience can get to you, because it's going to take a while if you want to really get it nice. And on this one, I kind of got impatient, as I said, and I actually didn't roll it out quite as thin as I meant to. I rolled this out to about a quarter of an inch thick, and what I really wanted for the cracker-style crust that I was going for was about an eighth of an inch, which is almost insane. That makes it go from like a 13 to 14 inch pizza to like almost a 16 just for that portion. So it makes it a much bigger pizza, and the cracker crust does actually it gets a little closer to the cracker crust. I still haven't cracked the cracker crust yet, but this actually made a really good thin crust. And if you happen to like flatbread style pizzas, the next one that I'm going to do is that I'm going to use the same dough recipe and everything, but if you just roll it out just a little bit less thin, so maybe a little over, well, like a third of an inch or a half an inch, at that point you will actually be able to get one that is a nice pillowy flatbread style. So this really is able to make two different styles of dough out of one recipe just by how you're baking it and what you're going to do with it. Once we reach about this thickness, it's going to go a little bit faster and it's going to grow in size dramatically. So let's just sort of fast forward through that, and while that's fast forwarding, let me explain one thing real quick. This mat that you see me rolling this out on is a silicone baking mat for kneading. It's very specifically for that purpose, and this is why you don't see me having to toss flour down and dust it and do any of that. If you're working on a regular counter or cutting board or table or anything that's not basically a silicone rolling mat, you'll probably need to dust it with a little flour. Usually semolina flour is the way to go in there because it doesn't actually absorb into the pizza crust and sort of cause it to be drier, and it does add a nice extra layer of flavor. So if you aren't using a silicone rolling mat, which most people probably aren't, you want to do something like that, just a light dusting of flour, and like I said, semolina would be great for that. And with the last of our rolling about to be done here, one thing I did do is I let it kind of relax. I peeled it up and let it relax for about 30 or 40 seconds before I went back and gave it just one more quick roll out to make sure that it was all there. There was about 2 or 3 more extra rollouts past there because I kept seeing parts that weren't perfectly round and kept trying to make them be round, which is not a great idea. So you probably don't want to do that. Once you're ready though, you can just gently lift it off the mat if you have it, or again, flour. If you don't, and put it onto your pizza tray. Now this pizza tray is a quote crisping pizza tray, and I'll explain that during the baking what that's actually doing and what I'm showing you here. Badly, it has air holes in the bottom. With the second one we're going to be making, I'm going to be rolling that out to about a half an inch thick, and in this case, for myself, since I don't have dairy or cheese myself, the pizza is a little bit more about the crust and the toppings. And so certain things like on mine, I'll use a little bit more pizza sauce than I would normally. So that way the toppings have something to stick to since the cheese isn't going to be there to hold them down. Or I would go with slightly thicker crust simply because more of what the flavor of the pizza for me, or not having cheese, becomes about the bread and the combination of the bread and the ingredients. So in this case, it's a much smaller pizza, probably 9-10 inches, maybe 11 at the max, and it's going to have the consistency of what you would imagine, say, any flatbread you've had, probably short of like pita bread, which would be a little too thin. But for the most part, any other type of flatbread you have, that's pretty much going to be the consistency of this, with a little bit of a crispy edge and exterior due to the tomato sauce caramelizing on top of it. So now that that's all rolled out, let's get these two topped, and then I'll show you the part in the oven, because there is one little tiny detail in the oven part that you're going to want to make sure you do. Alright, last step before we go into the oven is we're going to top it. Now, this is actually rested a little bit, so our dough has relaxed a bit. So as you can see, it's a little bit smaller than it was. So you probably, if you want it, if you're going for the cracker style super thin, you're going to want to roll that out again and then put your toppings on. I didn't, so this one doesn't quite reach the perfect, almost cracker crust I got, as close as I got. On these, also, within any type of thin crust pizza, you want to take your sauce all the way to the outside edge. The only thing that you're worried about on the outside edge being there that shouldn't is you don't want a coating of cheese on that outside like half an inch so it doesn't melt over the sides. It makes it much easier to eat, and it makes it a little more pleasant for the people that are eating. So what I'm going to try and do is just get as much even coverage of all the ingredients as I possibly can, because optimally for pizza, in my opinion, you want just basically some part of everything in every bite, at least potentially. Sometimes you won't get that, but if you can, that's really the nicest way to go. Now, as I mentioned, the cheese coverage, you don't really want to go to that outside edge. And again, the reason for that specifically is that the cheese will start to melt off of the edge, and it has the potential of either sagging out or causing sort of a greasy spot where you have to pick the pizza up. And you don't want that. So you want that outer edge to be just a little bit insulated from that so we don't get any sort of greasy or oily hands on this. So as I was mentioning, the cheese, we want that outer edge to be just a little bit dry so it doesn't go off the sides. But one thing you want to make sure of is don't put too much in the center either, because a lot of times people will end up with like a really big mound of cheese right in the center, and then everything else is kind of getting progressively thinner to the outside, and that actually makes the center of your pizza heavier and more prone to sort of flopping and falling apart. So just try and get as even a coverage as you possibly can. Hello, Arya. She's saying hello. Earlier, I had mentioned we were using a crisping pizza pan. Now, these have holes in them, and it's made to get more airflow to the area and also to allow the area to dry out more. If you've ever cooked a pizza at home in a pizza pan without holes, you know that the bottom doesn't tend to get... It doesn't crisp up very well, and sometimes it'll be just a little bit doughy, and it never gets a really nice color. This gets you the crispy part. It really doesn't get you the color part. Now, if you look at it here, this is the second use of this pan, and that's kind of the downfall of this style pan. Even though they do work, because the air holes are there, they also mean that the entire pan cools at an uneven rate every single time you take it out of the oven. So unless it is an abnormally thick pan, it's always going to warp like you see this. And that's just kind of a fact of life with these crisping pans, and unfortunately they all do that. So that may factor in whether you want one or not. Now, a better investment would be a pizza stone or something to cook that in the pizza where it'll retain that super high heat and it can sort of flash cook the bottom of the crust, since you're just dropping it directly on what is essentially almost the burner at that point. Both versions of this pizza cook for the exact same amount of time. We're doing 8 minutes at 450, and then you're going to turn it up to broil as the temperature and broil as the setting. And at that point, you're going to want to stand there, because it's only going to be 1 minute to 2 minutes before your cheese gets crispy enough, and if you aren't right there at the time, it could burn at the same time. So once you switch it to broil, you're kind of bound to stay there and just wait it out. But again, it's not going to take long. It's only going to be maybe 1 minute to 2 minutes at most, so you don't really have to worry about just standing there and hanging out for too much time. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the broil setting, bake uses both the top and the bottom element, primarily the bottom element of your oven's heating elements. In the case of broil will always be the top element, and if you set it to the broil setting on the temperature dial, that will be the maximum heat output your oven is capable of. So this is why we get super quick flash browning going on, and we get a really nice color on the cheese at the top, and at least for that portion of the sort of restaurant style pizza, we can get that nice bubbly crispy goodness there. Now, I was mentioning how adding a little bit of extra tomato sauce will help keep your toppings on a no cheese pizza for someone like myself in place. And as you can see here in these couple of close-up pictures, you can see how the pepperoni is kind of being held in place, whereas the ham not so much. The Canadian bacon and the black olives are doing fine again. It's kind of a pain because you don't have the cheese to hold things down, but if somebody has a dairy allergy or something similar to that, it still works. And it still tastes good, so you don't have to be like, oh, well, they can only eat chicken wings or whatever. Because while maybe not as nice as a cheese pizza, it's actually not bad at all itself. Once your pizza's all ready and done and out of the oven, you just gotta wait a couple of minutes to eat, and there you go. We have made a nice thin crust pizza. Now, this pizza recipe is very simple, and it should be able to be done by anyone, and that's one of the reasons that I didn't use some things like yeast and things like that. I wanted to get that cracker crust, and that's also a factor of the cracker crust. So having it turn out to be a nice flatbread pizza and turning out very well was not quite what I was hoping for, but it was a nice unexpected treat. I would like to thank you all for watching, and hopefully you have a great day and a great meal. And I've got another bit of footage here, probably about 2 minutes or so of the flatbread one rising in the oven for anyone who would like to watch. As I said, have a great day and a great meal.